But perhaps by way of review here, before we launch into the biggest question of them all that you might be wondering, Casey, what are the different components of a quantum computer?
But to understand why a refrigerator is even needed in the first place, I think we need to break this down a little bit. Hey everyone, welcome back to Chipstock Investor. Today we're going to do our second episode on quantum computing. We're going to talk about three more stocks and one ETF that may be right up your alley if you're interested in investing in quantum computing.
That's right, folks. Let's get right down to this. Quick refresher. If it's been more than a week since you watched it, and if you haven't watched it yet, check out the last quantum computing video first, where we give the high level overview of what it is, why you should care, and if it's worth investing in. But big spoiler, silly little company called NVIDIA has a lot to do with quantum computing right now. Check that out to understand why. So we did put this chart together though for the last video, just roughly illustrating the fact that quantum computing is really a culmination of a lot of other decades worth of computing technology, innovation, and advancement, especially of hardware, and most recently, a convergence between hardware and this whole AI thing that's now happening.
I honestly had never thought about quantum computing or quantum mechanics when I thought about the MRI machine, but that is what it is based on. Maybe even the best breakthrough that quantum mechanics have brought thus far. The MRI machine functions because of those superconducting magnets.
We'll talk a little bit about what those superconductors are exactly, and a little later in the video, discuss how all of this quantum computing stuff actually could lead to far bigger breakthroughs other than quantum computers themselves, like the MRI machine, and some stocks that might have a hand in developing that next big breakthrough. But perhaps by way of review here, before we launch into the biggest question of them all that you might be wondering, Casey, what are the different components of a quantum computer?
Much like classical computing, quantum computing has some of the same components. The first one is computing. You can think of that as the CPUs, the GPUs, that does all the number crunching, the logic of the computing system. And then networking, that's where all of the information moves between those parts, between the logic chips, the data storage, and into and out of the data center. There's also the storage compartment. That is where all that information is stored, either in queue waiting to be used, or maybe in long-term storage, waiting for that to be called up for data processing. And then finally, the last thing is what is added to quantum computing above classical computing. Now, classical computing does have some sensors, but in quantum computing, you need highly sensitive instruments that are used to detect and record those quantum mechanical effects.
So we'll come back to our semiconductor industry flow a little bit later. But Casey, given what you just said about quantum computers using a lot of the same components, a lot of the same parts as classical computers, naturally, the existing semiconductor industry is going to be critical in delivering these quantum computers. So we'll come back to this again and discuss this in conjunction with our primary stocks. So keep this in the back of your mind. If you want to invest in quantum computing, the semiconductor industry itself might simply just be the best way to invest in it long term. But the big question that we promised to answer at the end of the last episode, what is this thing? What does that even do? They show pictures of it all the time when media outlets talk about quantum computers, but there's pretty sparse explanations out there.
Well, essentially, it is a refrigerator. But to understand why a refrigerator is even needed in the first place, I think we need to break this down a little bit. We've talked about needing coolants of some sort, a fan or a chiller to remove that excess heat from all these GPUs and CPUs that are used in highly accelerated computing. So let's talk about why you would need that even more so in quantum computing.
Yeah, check out our last video where we talk about Vertiv Holdings. And this is very much a different type of thermal removal of heat from a computing system. Air and liquid cooling is not exactly what's going on here. There's a number of companies that make these things, what are known as dilution refrigerators. The one we've been showing you is from Form Factor, which is actually a publicly traded stock. So this is not the three stocks we promised you. Let's call Form Factor a bit of a bonus stock. We'll come back to that in just a second here, but a number of private companies that make these, you'll see Bluefor's listed or see their logo slapped on the side of quantum computing pictures. Another one called Maybell, another shown here called Zero Point Cryogenics. IBM itself doesn't actually make these dilution refrigerators, but they have experimented with them as they, continue to work on these superconducting quantum computers. So what you're often seeing in pictures is this refrigerator removed from its housing. This is what it often actually looks like in a research center. Oftentimes maybe a data center or like a mini data center with a ton of powerful enterprise computing stations like the AI servers that we're talking about all the time. It actually looks like the picture on the right. How these dilution refrigerators work is they pump two different isotopes of helium, helium-3 and helium-4. They're mixed together. So at the top is a pump, wiring, refrigerant, if you can call it that, chemical delivery lines, and et cetera. And those things are pumped in, and each of those plates underneath that top housing is a stage where the helium is mixed together, and that process of mixing them together creates a reaction where heat can be removed. And so each of those plates and the wiring and the pumps in between each of those plates represents a stage where more energy is removed, more heat is removed. And then at the very bottom is where the actual qubit chip or semiconductor or whatever it is the company is using, it's located at the very bottom on the underside of that last plate. And attached to all of those plates is various types of wiring and cable to take measurements and readings. And that's important too, because whenever you have cables and wiring and electricity, you're introducing a new heat source that needs to be removed. These things gobble up a ton of power, not very efficient. And it makes sense why it requires so much energy, because what they're trying to do to get superconducting to work is the scientists that work with these things are trying to get to absolute zero temperature, which is, if you remember your physics class, 0 Kelvin, or negative 273 degrees Celsius, or negative 460 degrees Fahrenheit, which is even a lot colder than outer space, believe it or not. So a lot of power used by these refrigerators.
We discussed this a little bit in our first video on quantum computing, but at the atomic level and smaller, the universe is governed by statistics, randomness. And this is what Einstein called God playing dice, or a spooky behavior of particles. Nevertheless, the summation of this randomness creates the world in which we experience. Quantum mechanics is not something that we perceive in everyday life. However, to observe, measure, and harness the power of the quantum realm, special conditions need to be met. One of those special conditions is close to absolute zero temperature, a state where there is no thermal energy. Atoms stop moving and there's no heat. At close to absolute zero and in a tightly controlled environment, almost devoid of any environmental factors like vibrations or naturally occurring radiation, certain types of elements can then be manipulated and measured at the quantum mechanical level.
So if you're looking for a way to invest in those dilution refrigerators, which are used by IBM, Google, Microsoft, a lot of quantum computing startups, Form Factor has this dilution refrigerator segment of its business that, again, it acquired a couple of years ago. If you remember back to our semiconductor manufacturing equipment and chip packaging video and manual, we talked about Form Factor in the test and probe cards section. Most of these companies, we said, did not have a lot of differentiation from each other, fairly commoditized type of manufacturing equipment and parts. Form factor is a bit of an exception to this rule, in part because of this unit. And along with those refrigerators, they actually have probe card systems and probe cards used to test equipment that will eventually go into these quantum computers, where the components need to be highly sensitive. They need to be able to work and operate in these very intensely harsh environments close to 0 Kelvin. You can't just throw any old chip into those things and expect them to work the same or at all at room temperature. So form factor involved a lot in the quantum computing industry that way.
We will share a few pictures that show what Intel's been working on as far as quantum computing goes. They have the silicon spin qubit wafer. Here's that same chip from Intel when it's packaged, as well as the size of it here fits on the tip of your finger, the Intel Tunnel Falls silicon spin qubit chip.
Yeah, so that big, massive fridge that eats up all of that power, something very, very tiny sits at the very bottom of that thing. Pretty wild. I think this probably illustrates why quantum computing is just not there yet as a fully fledged industry. For most investors, just be content to invest in big tech companies to get like your quantum computing development exposure in your portfolio.
Before we dive into those 3 stocks and 1 ETF that we promised, make sure you are subscribed to the channel. And if you're interested in some of our show notes and our published manuals, like one that's going to be placed with this video on quantum computing, it has some expanded explanations and more information in it. Consider joining the membership for $5 a month. You get Discord access as well as all of our video notes. You can do that over on Ko-fi. We'll make sure the link is in the description. Okay, let's jump in. Let's talk about those 3 stocks. Skywater and Allegro, we haven't talked about a ton this year. We've covered both of these companies in the past. Applied Materials, of course, we have sung their praises many times, but let's break down these 3 and how they are playing in this quantum computing space.
Well, Skywater is an interesting one. Casey, we have some more updates on Skywater getting ready to hit our YouTube community board and over on Discord. But when we've talked about it in the past, talked about Skywater as a chip fab startup for other startups. One of the startups that Skywater is partnering with and doing these co-research and co-development plans is PsiQuantum. They've also mentioned D-Wave Quantum, which is one of the 3 quantum computing pure play startups that are actually publicly traded. But you pulled this one specifically from PsiQuantum because they had some press releases with Skywater in this last year.
We'll show you a few videos and screenshots from PsiQuantum's website. If you have some interest in quantum computing, they have a great presentation on what kind of problems quantum computing can solve. Their goal is to make quantum computers more accessible. You can see that wafer looks very similar to what we showed you with Intel. And the little video that they're showing there in the bottom left, these quantum wafers are being made at global foundries. This quantum chip is really a photonic qubit, and it explains that they were repurposed integrated photonics technology, which was originally developed for telecom and data center networking applications. Here's a photo of these chips being placed into a package. This is interesting because it notes that even though these packages need to be operated at a cryogenic temperature, they're able to use predominantly conventional technologies like PCBs, copper heat sinks, and bonding. Next, we have PsiQuantum's cryogenic cabinet. This is where these packages are placed into the computing device. You can see on the right side, they have that liquid helium delivery chamber to keep these centers cool. PsiQuantum uses 2 facilities, one in the UK and a partnership as well in California. These sites look very similar to a data center for quantum computing. Finally, an infographic on the type of software they're using for quantum computers. They use a language that is very familiar to classical computing, Python.
Now, we show you all of that because PsiQuantum is just one startup working very hard on quantum computers, but a massive amount of research and development goes into developing those wafers. As you mentioned, production being handled by global foundries, but a lot of the research and development itself is happening with none other than Skywater technology. They mentioned the quantum computing industry as one of those promising co-development programs. Also, a lot of healthcare companies working on new semiconductor technology with them, a lot of different communications chips, a lot of different types of sensors, many of which need to be tested and operated in very harsh conditions. So, cryogenic type of testing and manufacturing processes happening at Skywater Technology. Again, a startup that services other startups. Skywater, a bit of a bet on the quantum computing industry.
Skywater fits into that chip fab and contract manufacturer in the semiconductor flow chart. Now let's move on to our second company, Allegro Microsystems. They fit into the fabless chip design portion of the industry. At the beginning of the video, we talked about quantum computing needing very complex, sensitive sensors. And that's exactly what Allegro Microsystems develops. And maybe you can tell us, Nick, why their acquisition of Crocus is even more of a play on that.
So before Allegro acquired this startup called Crocus last year, Crocus itself had some research papers that they were doing about TMR sensors or tunnel magnetoresistance sensors. We did a video on what those are last year. We'll put a link to that below. We talked about that in light of Crocus becoming part of the Allegro business. And this is maybe where we can mention that perhaps some of the greatest technology breakthroughs coming from quantum computing development won't be the quantum computers themselves. It could be other things, kind of like the superconducting magnets that make MRIs work. Perhaps this is another one of those. These TMR sensors can sense very, very small changes in magnetic fields. And the reason why Allegro bought Crocus was it wanted the technology for use in industrial applications, in automotive, in other next gen power delivery systems, where a highly sensitive sensor can help speed up the energy efficiency of these things. But make no mistake, while TMR sensors maybe aren't necessarily going to become this integral part of a quantum computing unit, TMR sensors very much do make use of quantum mechanics. So there is this very general research that we have shown here from ID TechX, talking about some of the expected growth rates of the sensor market, next gen sensor market in the coming decade. And TMR sensors, one of those type of sensors that makes use of quantum sensing, quantum mechanics to help with all sorts of things. Three-dimensional location sensing, which has all sorts of uses in wearables. Think the amazing technology that powers your smartwatch and makes all the awesome features in that work. Again, power delivery, sensing for self-driving vehicles, factory automation, and other equipment, healthcare equipment, you name it. Developments in quantum mechanics and figuring out how to sense changes in quantum mechanics could be a massive success story for a company like Allegro Microsystems.
Okay, that brings us to our final stock of this episode, Applied Materials. And that fits into the wafer fab packaging and assembly equipment. And we've discussed Applied Materials many times, Nick. We are a big fan of this company. Where does it fit into the quantum computing space?
We talk about this all the time. Wafer fab and chip packaging equipment is a critical choke point in the semiconductor industry. Think of these companies as like the bouncer at the door if you want into the party. The party is selling chips to a very, very large market. If you want in on that party, you're going to have to go through the wafer fab businesses. Applied Materials, one of the largest, at the very top of that sub industry, along with ASML Holding. Now, I picked this one, Casey, because it's interesting here. Applied Materials does not talk a lot about quantum computing, but they do have the broadest set of tools for making semiconductors, for making the wafers, as well as packaging the chips. And a number of years ago, almost 5 years ago now, they did have this article, and it was sort of an industry conference discussion and set of talks where they talked about the massive amount of innovation that's going to need to take place in the coming years to make quantum computers a reality. And because of its business model, where Applied tends to collaborate with its customers and figure out how its machines can be used to make chips and package chips and eventually stick those in computing systems and power systems, you can definitely bet that many of these startups working on these chips and quantum computers and sensors are using applied materials machines. I believe what we could say here is simply that applied materials is already going to have a place at the table for whatever the next big thing is in computing technology and in power system technology or whatever. The equipment's already there and ready to go. And because it's such a broad portfolio of equipment, I think it's safe to assume that they can pull on that lever when the time comes to say, hey, you know what? Quantum computing is now a growth market. Let's get in on that game.
Absolutely. Makes a lot of sense. There's our three stocks: Skywater Technology, Allegro Microsystems, and Applied Materials. Those are all three companies that an investor could add to their portfolio for a play in quantum computing. Now, let's take a look at an ETF that would also get you some of this exposure as well.
That's right. Let's talk about the Vanguard Information Technology ETF, ticker symbol VGT. This is one that we've owned for about a decade now. Absolutely obliterated the market. You can see average almost 13% average annual returns since inception. It has not just beat the S&P 500, as a result, also beat the NASDAQ composite by a very wide margin. Now, there's over 300 stocks in VGT, and about 60% of the portfolio is dominated by 10 tech giants. And these are very familiar names and application software, of course, semiconductor companies, systems, software, and equipment. You can see those 10 names here. Again, name brand stuff: Microsoft, Apple, NVIDIA. Collectively, the top 10 positions make up 60% of this ETF's holdings. But the beauty of this, besides getting some ancillary exposure to quantum computing via all the tech giants that are allocating a little bit of R&D to things like quantum computing, you have this long tail of several hundred mid-cap, small cap, and micro cap stocks. So the portfolio is designed to be moved by the top 10 holdings, the top 10 tech giants. What's interesting, though, is if you scroll down to some of the smaller holdings at the end of Vanguard's list here, you see some of the small caps and the micro caps here. Perhaps one of these businesses one day becomes that next big thing. Maybe it's a quantum computing stock that's publicly traded. Maybe it's something else entirely. Maybe quantum computing completely doesn't lead to the next bull market of the 2030s. We've been trying to show this slide a bit more frequently because we are on the cusp of, or at the very beginning of, a new bull market powered by the semiconductor industry and accelerated computing market. We have a very rough timeline here of how we think that will play out. And perhaps by 2030 and beyond, something like the quantum computing era begins to extend the acceleration of compute power. But maybe it's something else entirely that leads the charge higher. It's too soon to say what that will be, but whatever it is, there's a decent chance that basket of companies is somewhere in Vanguard IT ETF as one of those small cap or mid caps. And it's interesting, a decade ago, NVIDIA, Broadcom, and AMD were very small, almost insignificant positions in Vanguard ETF. In fact, Broadcom wasn't even there because at the time it was two separate companies. But in recent years, as those three stocks, especially NVIDIA and Broadcom, took over as market leaders, they have skyrocketed into the top 10 holdings list, as you could see earlier in the screen share. So that's the beauty of an ETF like VGT. We've had it for a long time. We continue to hold it. And if you're interested in things like quantum computing, it really could be just that simple. Owning the big tech giants and a long tail of small caps that could be that next big thing at some point down the road. And you get all of that in one convenient package.
All right, that's a wrap. Make sure you are subscribed to the channel. We have lots more content coming your way. If you're interested in gallium nitride, we have a company for you, and it's not Navitas. Stay tuned. It's a big one. And we'll be also making a video on applied materials next week. If you have questions or comments or want to talk about this quantum computing even more, head over to our Discord channel. You can gain access to that via Ko-fi or YouTube. Check that out. Our membership is in the link below. Just $5 a month gets you a lot of stuff. We'll see you over there. Thanks again, everyone from Chipstock Investor. See you soon.